Just a night like any other night, my wife and I were sitting here playing Call of Duty. We heard like a lot of sirens and a lot of craziness going on, so we got up and we're like, let's go see, the whole sky was glowing.
A train derailed in Ohio.
A train derailment in a small Ohio town.
The town is under a state of emergency after 50 train cars derailed, causing a massive fire a half-mile long.
38 cars derailed and a fire ensued which damaged an additional 12 cars.
Officials are ordering everyone within that 1 mile radius to leave your home immediately.
We made it a block and you could just see the flames. I mean, they were a couple hundred feet in the air.
Like the doors of hell were open.
If the temperature continued to rise, it could lead to a catastrophic
explosion. It was decided to blow holes in all 5 cars with explosives and burn off the material.
There were hazardous materials on board this train.
They were carrying well over 115,000 gallons of vinyl chloride.
The vinyl chloride.
Norfolk Southern railroad crews initiated a controlled release to the 5 rail cars with the toxic chemicals.
That in turn produced a huge plume of smoke, and with it, serious health and environmental concerns.
Breathing issues, tightness in our chest, severe headaches.
Contaminated drinking water.
Look at it.
It's all in the bottom of the creek bed.
It's terrible to look at. You shouldn't walk through a creek and see piles of dead things floating past you. Everything in the creek is dead.
There is no way we are safe being here.
This is worse than what everybody thought it was.
It is decimating our businesses.
Governor DeWine puts all the blame on the rail company and says they should be paying for everything.
Tensions flared tonight at a town hall between residents and government officials.
Norfolk Southern planned to be there, but backed out at the last minute because of what they called a growing physical threat to its employees.
What do you need right now from the government and from Norfolk Southern that you're not getting?
We just want answers. How can you come into a little town like this, make a big oopsie, and just go about your day?
This line is on its way to one of our many destinations across the globe.
We are headed out from our hotel. We're driving out to East Palestine. It's about a 40-minute drive. Found a guy named Luke who is willing to sit down with us for an interview and give us kind of a perspective of the locals in the town about what's going on, how people are feeling. So super excited for that. We're going to go and see what this is all about. On February 3rd, 2023, at 8:55 p.m., a Norfolk Southern train carrying high-hazard flammable chemicals derailed in the town of East Palestine, Ohio. About 50 cars came off the tracks, with several catching fire, prompting first responders to trigger a sudden evacuation of the town.
I said it was like a movie. People were coming and going because you didn't know what would happen. You had cops coming to the doors telling you gotta go. Town was being evacuated. My name is Luke Glavin. We are in East Palestine, Ohio, about half mile from the derailment. People didn't want to go because they didn't think that it was that serious, but everybody was in a state of panic. My wife and I didn't know what to grab because you didn't know if your house was gonna be blown up or burnt down or if we weren't gonna be able to come back because of some other reason. We didn't know.
In the immediate aftermath of the crash, the release of chemicals into the environment, most notably vinyl chloride, a known carcinogen and more generally a toxic chemical, is believed to have caused severe damage to the local environment. Reports and videos from people in the area showed nearby animals sick or dying, with an estimated 43,000 fish and other aquatic animals dying as a result of the derailment. In the most publicized instance, this pet fox died in its owner's arms just days after the crash. But the flames didn't die out on their own. 3 days after the derailment, on February 6th, Norfolk Southern started what's called a controlled burn in order to prevent a possible explosion of some of the remaining train cars. Then a couple days later, on the 8th, the evacuation order was lifted, and people went back home with some less than reassuring messages from the state government.
Governor, if you were to live in the area, would you feel comfortable moving back into your home?
Look, I think that I would be drinking the bottled water, and I would be continuing to find out what the tests were showing as far as the air. I would be alert and concerned, but I think I would probably be back in my house.
After the accident, I wish that it just would have been dealt with way quicker. The ball would have been rolling quicker than just having Governor DeWine come in here, say it was okay, and the railroad was going to take care of it. I wish that the federal government would have got involved, and that would have gave them, the tracks wouldn't have been in as quick as they were. They laid down the tracks. There was trucks here with train tracks on it the day before the controlled burn. So they were ready to go and get that. That was their main goal. And that was imminent by after the evacuation was lifted. It wasn't even 2 minutes after it was lifted. There was trains blowing their whistles to come through town.
But when they came back, many people reported symptoms like nausea, headaches, rashes, and lightheadedness, and understandably remained concerned about the safety of the area.
So guys, look, this is that film. Just so everybody can see here, I'm gonna step on it. It's already in the soil, so you gotta get it like kinda, look. Holy. We're not making this shit up, man.
I've heard of like giving people headaches.
Oh yeah, tingling lips, that was my big thing. Tingling lips, burning eyes, really bad.
Luke told us about a creek just down the street from where he lives, and we decided to check it out for ourselves.
How it's bubbling up like that. This film, it just sits on top of the water like dish detergent or something, and the smell is it's a really particular chemically smell. And this water is right here. Town's right there. There are houses all around this. And that guy over there, we noticed he's been flying a drone over this creek, so they're definitely keeping an eye on the situation here. But that water, man, that is not safe.
So the VOCs that were released from those chemicals, they attach to everything. We have VOCs in our home every day, plastic products, we have VOCs. But there's a certain level, and when they set those off, the controlled burn, they attach to everything, fabrics, plastics, everything they just attach to. So they told us to throw away, your Tupperware, your plastic stuff, clean all your stuff, deep clean it. But they said, well, don't use chemicals and stuff like that.
One thing that just came to mind, all of this testing is being conducted by
Norfolk. All of the testing being done right now is 100% Norfolk. They are outsourcing it to companies, and they are coming in here and doing it. The testing that's being done, the air testing, is just oxygen testing to make sure the levels are okay. It's not being tested for toxins and stuff like that. I talked to a guy earlier on the street, and he is actually checking these boxes, and he couldn't even give me an answer of what they're checking for. He just says toxins, but they don't even know. That's why town's worried, because they just have people in here doing their job, but what they're doing their job isn't even helping us. So there has actually been some people that have reached out to me that want to do third-party testing. They have labs and such that they're going to do some water testing, and then we are working with some people too that are doing soil testing.
In the weeks that followed the immediate crisis response, as the emergency started to be contained, Norfolk Southern began to face increased scrutiny. And as a response, very early on, the company announced that it would not only continue conducting air and water quality tests, but would clean up the contaminated soil near the crash site, preventing further contamination of the water with a new dam and water bypass, and would be offering compensation to some of the residents of the area. Of course, as with most corporate promises, what's said and what's done are two very different things. In fact, some of their efforts to look responsible are actually making matters worse.
They're air stripping this, which means the vinyl chloride's coming out of the water and going into the air. Don't let your kids ride their bikes down there. I saw a bunch of kids down there watching these guys pump this water. Stay away. It's going into the air. This needs to be air stripped in a container. You see these rain for rent tanks all over town? They need to be spraying and aerating that water in those tanks and then vacuuming off the air and cleaning the air and capturing it. Right now that stuff's going right into the air. So if you live adjacent to a creek that's experiencing this aeration, you need to keep your windows closed and you need to watch it very, very carefully. And we need to work together to get this practice stopped.
How do you feel that Norfolk Southern has responded to your concerns? We've heard about payments of something like $25,000 for the town, or a $1 million fund. How much money have you and your family seen of that? Is that actually happening? Is this pretty typical for this kind of accident?
So in terms of compensation, they have just offered the inconvenience payment of $1,000 and any reimbursement for food, hotel stay, and clothing. But even then, the clothing was just, you couldn't take them a whole wardrobe. So the $1,000 inconvenience payment was if you lived within the 1 mile. That started first. And a lot of people got really upset because chemicals don't know a 1 mile radius. So they actually extended it to all of our area code, 44413, that's East Palestine. If you were inside of that, you got the $1,000. I feel that that's a slap in the face because that's all they're offering us.
In the press, Norfolk announced they'd be donating $25,000 to East Palestine families and establishing a $1 million fund, which for the town's 5,000 residents works out to just $5 and $212 respectively. These amounts are nothing. They're worse than nothing. They're an insult to the people they just poisoned. Hey, we know you need to move out of your home, maybe forever. Here's a couple $100 to start over somewhere else. The future of the entire community and all its residents is uncertain, and a few coins tossed by the perpetrators on their way out of town doesn't solve anything.
What's really weighing on my mind today is just the long term and our house value. You know, if I want to sell this down the road and, you know, try and make this a rental property, how do I even bring people in here? You know, I tried meeting up with a guy on Marketplace and he wouldn't even come close to town. Everybody sees this as a chemical disaster, a wasteland. I just want everybody to do what they're gonna say they're gonna do, and I just pray that everything going forward goes smoothly and that our community can once get back to what it used to be, a tight-knit, everybody knows everybody, fun-loving town.
To understand how the East Palestine derailment happened, we need to go back about a decade. Between 2012 and 2014, North America was hit with a string of devastating train derailments. In 2012, a train derailed in Paulsboro, New Jersey, and it released 23,000 gallons of toxic vinyl chloride gas into the air. In 2013, a train carrying crude oil derailed near Castleton in North Dakota, and around a dozen cars erupted in flames. And the next year, in Lynchburg, Virginia, another train derailed, this time causing 50,000 gallons of oil to ignite and spill into the James River. But by all accounts, the most destructive and infamously memorable derailment of the time has to be the Lac-Mégantic disaster. In July 2013, a 73-car freight train carrying crude oil derailed in the town of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec, Canada. The train exploded, killing 47 people and destroying more than 40 buildings in the Lac-Mégantic downtown area. Catastrophic derailments like this, which accompanied the more generalized, record-level oil train spills at the time, created concern. After all, between 2008 and 2014, the amount of crude oil being transported by train went from around 9,500 carloads to a massive 500,000. It wasn't all that surprising that these numbers were on the rise, and it didn't take long after Lac-Mégantic for these now pervasive crude oil loads traveling across the country to be labeled bomb trains by activists and the press. Train safety was on people's minds in a sudden, major way, but for some people, it already had been for a while. Railroad unions had been advocating for better rail safety for years before these crashes. Crashes that destroyed ecosystems and flattened towns. Specifically, unions were sounding the alarm on a trend that today goes by the name precision scheduled railroading. You might have heard about PSR these past few weeks. Precision scheduled railroading is a generic term that encompasses a few different business practices, all of which are centered around the same goal: cutting costs and reducing the operating ratios for rail companies. Some of these practices are fairly benign and common sense, but that's not true for everything under the PSR umbrella. With PSR, the aim is to get below a roughly 60% operating ratio. which in practical terms means that companies are shooting for only 60 cents of each dollar they make going towards actually running the railroads, with the remaining 40% going towards executive pay and dividends to investors. Investors who, in the last few decades, have increasingly been large Wall Street financial groups. Today, 6 of the 7 Class 1 railroad companies, the companies with the highest revenues that together make up 94% of the freight rail industry's earnings, use PSR cost-cutting strategies explicitly. And it's arguably the change that's made the profit margins of the top 5 US railroads double these past 15 years. Just to give you an idea of how much money we're talking about here, in the first 6 months of 2022, a handful of rail companies were so flush with cash, they put $10 billion in stock buybacks. And it's not just thanks to PSR. Railroads are a natural monopoly. It doesn't make much sense to compete over the same routes, the same rails, the same land, and the insane cost of getting a rail company started when profits are possibly years or decades down the line. And as a good reflection of that, the industry is currently a tight-knit oligopoly. Around the 90s, mostly led by this guy, rail companies figured out how to take advantage of that, and found that the best way to make profits and increase their investors' returns was to stop acting in the best interest of the public, and to some extent even their clients, by making the rail networks less and less safe, with fewer investments and upgrades, catering more heavily to larger businesses at the expense of smaller companies, and gutting their workforce. The idea being that lower costs could mean a bigger cut of the profits. But what does that mean in practice? 1. Longer trains. Longer trains are the norm for freight companies today.
Freight railroads are now running consistently longer trains, upwards of 10,000 to 15,000 feet. That equates to 2 or 3 mile long trains, or to put it another way, 33 football fields.
These longer trains are harder to stop. If an accident happens, it can quickly escalate with more cars getting involved by default. Their heavier weight can cause more damage to the rails more quickly, and they're harder to inspect thoroughly. The reason they're harder to inspect for safety is because PSR also implies 2. Fewer, more overworked rail workers. Since 2015, 30% of the freight rail workforce has been laid off. 45,000 workers. This follows a general trend in the rail industry of companies cutting costs by getting rid of more and more workers.
The railroad workers who remain have been forced to do more with less. They are faced with discipline or dismissal if they refuse to comply, and the consequences of these choices are no longer hypothetical. Carriers are also compensating for reduced staffing by requiring remaining employees to perform work outside of their craft, in addition to fulfilling their regular duties. At best, this may involve employees performing tasks with which they are not experienced. At worst, employees may be forced to do work for which they are not qualified. Furthermore, rather than maintaining appropriate staffing levels, carriers are mandating overtime for workers who are already stretched thin and penalizing workers who refuse to come to work when they are sick. In an industry where fatigue is a constant risk factor, exposing employees to additional fatigue by asking them to work longer, faster, or perform multiple jobs, especially while sick, is a recipe for disaster. The FRA's own safety data shows that since 2009, the number of railroad accidents and incidents reported to the FRA has not meaningfully declined. Derailments, fatalities, and collisions all increased in the years leading up to the pandemic. Given the notorious pressure that railroads put on their workers to prevent them from reporting incidents to the FRA, we suspect that these accidents and incidents are severely undercounted, especially during the pandemic when safety risks have been much higher and normal government functions, including safety inspections, were curtailed. The bottom line is that PSR prioritizes short-term profits over the long-term health and safety of our freight rail system. Between reports from frontline employees at the FRA's own data and the FRA's own data, it is clear that PSR puts rail workers and the public at a real and unacceptable safety risk.
And finally, the last big part of the PSR strategy is 3. Avoiding safety upgrades to train tech and lobbying to make sure they never get imposed. If we go back to all those derailments in the early 2010s, they got the public's attention and motivated regulators in the US to set their sights on rail companies. In response to derailments like Lock-Megantic in 2014, the Obama administration did improve safety procedures, but just barely. An original rule intended to fit dangerous trains with a better braking system, ECP brakes, as opposed to air brake technology dating back to the Civil War, was completely gutted by industry lobbying before it was passed. Despite the safety concerns of regular people in the path of increasingly dangerous trains, lobbyists for the chemical, oil, and rail industries all came together to make sure that these improved braking systems, which the rail industry had actually been boasting about for years, would only be applied to a few trains. To do that, these companies lobbied to make sure that trains running several dangerous carloads wouldn't be required to have better brakes so long as there were fewer than 20 dangerous cars in a row, or 35 in total over the length of the train. What's more, chemical lobbyists specifically proposed a new, restrictive definition of what a high-hazard flammable train is, to make sure that trains like the Norfolk Southern one in Ohio carrying vinyl chloride would not have to be equipped with this safer braking system. Many known dangerous substances wouldn't fall under the chemical lobby's definition of dangerous, and that way, they could travel on leaner, cheaper, but empirically more unsafe trains. In other words, for these companies, accidents are not something to be avoided, but are rather just another variable in their business model. Safety is a cost that needs to be minimized, not a priority, and certainly not a factor that can take precedence over profit. To be clear, safety and profit don't always conflict with one another. The thing is that when they do, companies aren't out there lobbying for more safety. Someone was always, inevitably, predictably going to be hurt. And at least right now, it looks like that meant East Palestine.
So disasters like this, I've been saying since day one, it's an industrial disaster. Those can be prevented. They can be prevented not like a tire blowing on a car prevented. They can be prevented because they should have strict maintenance schedules. They should have strict, that car wasn't a hazardous chemical car or train. How was that not a hazardous chemical train?
And this resistance to safety regulation is incredibly strong, despite freight rail being one of the most profitable industries in the US, raking in over $146 billion since 2015. Just to put the price of safety in perspective, the railroad industry itself estimated that it would only cost $3 billion to implement better braking systems. Not a huge expense, but compared to lobbying and just not doing the upgrades, corporations are always going to take the cheaper option. After first gutting the Obama regulations, when Trump and the Republicans gained control of the government, rail companies leveraged their funding once again, this time to the tune of $6 million in GOP campaign financing. With the new administration in their pocket, like with the previous government, rail companies successfully made sure that Trump's administration would repeal the Obama-era rules on the basis of a miscalculated cost-benefit analysis. To quickly recap, the initial, relatively weak regulation of the Obama era was repealed under the next administration. Despite Democrats and Republicans desperately pointing fingers at each other for East Palestine, they are both culpable. And today, the Biden admin is acting like it can't do anything to prevent future accidents. On February 14th, 11 days after the derailment in East Palestine, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg tweeted this: "We're constrained by law on some areas of rail regulation, like the braking rule withdrawn by the Trump administration in 2018 because of a law passed by Congress in 2015. But we are using the powers we do have to keep people safe." This tweet is, plainly speaking, a lie. Pete's department has the ability to redo the cost-benefit analysis correctly, which would bring back the Obama-era rule. It can expand the definition of hazardous materials to include known carcinogens like vinyl chloride, and make sure those trains are treated with increased attention. And it can even impose ECP brakes on certain trains, according to this article in The Lever. But the Biden admin has no more interest in pursuing safety than previous administrations. Before the East Palestine train derailment, the Buttigieg Transportation Department was even considering an industry-backed rule relaxing brake testing requirements. That is, making trains even less safe. Unsurprisingly, once again, 5 major rail unions have stood in common-sense opposition to this attempt to make railways even less safe. The sad reality is that over the past decade, the story has remained remarkably consistent. Unions warn about the degradation of safety on the tracks, rail companies use the piles of money they made by caring less about safety to influence policy and make sure that safety is even further reduced, and as a result, we suffer preventable, catastrophic accidents. Doing research for this video, I cannot stress how tiring and frustrating it was to come across dozens of articles, press releases, hearings, presentations at conventions, and testimonials from years ago where people keep saying the same things over and over again. Safety isn't being prioritized. A devastating accident is all but certain. We need regulation and investment in security to protect people from disasters. When profit is the only thing that matters, safety is an unnecessary luxury. It was only a matter of time before something like East Palestine happened, and everyone was just waiting around to see where it was going to hit. And the cherry on top of this blatant disregard for safety is that rail companies are trying to make it seem like their lobbying is actually pro-safety, and even pro-environment. For example, in their comments on the proposed Obama 2014 regulation that would have required higher brake safety standards, rail companies keep referencing how if these regulations are implemented, the cost of rail would go up, and therefore businesses would prioritize truck freight, which is worse for the environment. But rail companies are not only pushing all their smaller clients off onto trucks by reducing their workforce. Just one look at the importance of fossil fuel transportation for rail companies' bottom lines, and the carelessness with which they lobby against regulations that make accidents like East Palestine, with its plumes of smoke and rivers filled with dead fish less likely, reveal how insincere their concern for the environment actually is. And okay, by the time this video releases, we'll certainly know more about the crash and its causes. The point of the past couple minutes hasn't been to nail down the details of which specific regulations and business practices had an impact on this one derailment, but to point out something relevant to just about every derailment in this country. Sadly, they happen all the time. East Palestine is a tragic example of one of the more catastrophic ones, but an even more devastating event could happen any day now, and plenty of less harmful derailments happen every day. The US sees an average of over 1,000 train derailments a year. The purpose of going behind the scenes for a bit is to point out a pattern, not a specific, relevant regulatory failure. A pattern in which unions, the public, and usually smaller, disenfranchised communities consistently have their concerns for safety and environmental protection run over by companies looking for the largest possible margins, and those companies getting the green light from government institutions they've captured. 25 million people in this country live within a 1-mile radius of a crude by rail route. Dangerous trains are all around us, and not by our decision. The least we are owed is control over their safety. Seriously, what do we all gain from these companies neglecting safety for the sake of executive profits? Something that came up in our interview, and just chatting with people around town, was how abandoned they all felt by the media narrative around this incident.
This was the second largest chemical disaster in United States history, and it's not being televised or anything like that. And I feel that we should be getting way more attention to this.
And that's not just a feeling. He's absolutely right that this derailment wasn't being talked about very much. On February 5th, 2 days after the derailment, Pete Buttigieg was on 3 Sunday news shows: CNN's State of the Union, NBC's Meet the Press, and ABC's This Week. Pete wasn't asked about East Palestine, nor did he feel the need to bring it up on any of these shows, with the broadcast focusing almost exclusively on the whole Chinese weather balloon thing. But it's not just Pete. This was a trend. A Media Matters study of the first 10 days of reporting on major cable networks, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, and broadcasters, ABC, CBS, and NBC, found that East Palestine only received 3 hours of coverage in total for those 10 days. And from February 10th to 12th, it got no coverage whatsoever. And to make matters worse, in those few hours when East Palestine was on America's TVs, the Media Matters study found that the responsibility of rail companies in lobbying away safety regulations and deteriorating safety on the tracks wasn't addressed. To quote the study directly, "With little exception, this story has been covered on corporate TV news as an accident, with outlets showing little curiosity about the circumstances that make these types of incidents not just more likely, but perhaps inevitable." In all fairness, reporting has picked up since those first 10 days, but the framing largely hasn't changed. East Palestine is still being covered mostly as a natural disaster. That's negligent. The press is supposed to hold power accountable. But media institutions and rail companies being owned by the same interest complicates that task. And to add another problem to the pile, in a shocking twist no one could have seen coming, this lack of coverage was seized upon by the far right to try to convey the same white supremacist narrative Trump seized on in 2016, that white conservatives are being ignored because they're white conservatives. Despite Fox being equally culpable of neglecting East Palestine in the days following the derailment, Jesse Waters, Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, Greg Gutfeld, Benny Johnson, Sean Duffy, Lisa Booth, and Brian Kilmeade all made claims blaming wokeism in some way or another for the lack of coverage, and citing the fact that because the residents of East Palestine are largely white and conservative, they got less attention in the press. To be clear, this is a baseless accusation, and implies that disasters in Democrat-leaning communities of color are covered better, which just isn't true. To quote Media Matters again, "Coverage of public health and environmental crises affecting communities of color is frequently poor in both quantity and quality." But in any case, the primary purpose of this kind of rhetoric isn't to demand justice for the people of East Palestine, who were absolutely ignored, but rather to push a white nationalist narrative of a war on white people. And the result of this approach that all these conservatives took is that it changes the enemy of this story. No longer is the attention on companies who have verifiably neglected the safety of communities all across the US. Instead, the enemy is some mythical woke elite. In both these cases, neglect and diversion, at the height of media attention for East Palestine, large corporate media institutions failed the public. They have broadly ignored the culpability of rail companies and the consequences of their homicidal thirst for profits, and in doing so have weakened people's ability to advocate for their own security. By framing East Palestine as an accident, corporate media companies have made the ruler by which we measure justice, how well does Norfolk Southern clean up its mess? And the answer is, not well. But regardless of how well Norfolk deals with the fallout of this derailment, it's a band-aid on a bullet wound. Not only will this crisis follow East Palestine for decades, long after Norfolk is out of the public eye and the pressure to take responsibility disappears, not only will this crisis not hurt Norfolk Southern all that much, this accident-centric narrative doesn't ask why people are in the line of fire in the first place, and who might benefit from keeping them there. Our last night in East Palestine coincided with a town hall, so we went.
First and second rows have power. If you don't need power,
you're not alone, and it feels like it. And every community I've been going to for 30 years gets the same runaround. And I can't tell you how many communities feel that these moments are the biggest gaslight of their life because you experienced it. You have symptoms. You want to be heard, but you're going to be told it's safe. You're going to be told not to worry. Well, that's just rubbish. I've never seen anything in 30 years like this. And the situation happening in East Palestine.
So it was about an hour and a half. They did give a lot of information about the chemicals that were on the train, which I think will be helpful for the people in the community. There was good advice to go get tested and stuff like that. This was a deliberate choice. This was preventable. All Norfolk had to do was make the proper investments, and this kind of thing could have been prevented. Obviously, that was not the choice they made. They chose to protect their investments, protect their stockholders. And that's how you get disasters like these. That's why you have all these people filing out of this auditorium hearing about their increased risk of all sorts of cancer. So,
look, we can talk about suing rail companies all day, but paying fines and lobbying for more favorable conditions is built into their operating cost calculations. Norfolk is okay with putting a little money into East Palestine, maybe even paying a fine or getting sued, because it will always be cheaper to accept a tiny slap on the wrist than to actually invest in the safety of the railroads. The reality is that so long as the profit motive remains the driving factor, nothing will meaningfully change. It's time to nationalize the railways. If an industry is too important to do without, then that industry should be nationalized. No one should be able to profit from a necessary service, especially to the tune of millions of dollars a year, and especially when those dollars are stained with the blood of the innocent, decent people of this country. Nationalization and public ownership are the way forward. It would mean actually investing in safety, operations, infrastructure, and people, not pulling out those 40 cents on the dollar as profit. It would mean empowering rail workers who are there on the ground doing the work, as well as people who live near the tracks, and not catering to a few executives and shareholders who only care about the number going up and don't really care how. Most highways and waterways are already publicly owned in this country, and rail is a public service in countless countries already. It's just not that hard to imagine how this would work. It is past time we stop beating around the bush. The executives of Norfolk Southern, and of the rest of the rail industry, and of the chemical, oil and gas, pharmaceutical, and countless other critical industries, are criminals and murderers. They think that we're a bunch of ignorant peasants and that we're too stupid and powerless to do anything about it. These people serve no productive purpose. They each siphon millions of dollars a year from the people who actually do the work. One day, sooner or later, we'll reach a critical mass of people who realize that we're better off without the profit motive. A better world is possible. If you made it this far, I'd first like to thank you for watching all the way to the end. It really does help. As you might have noticed from this episode, we're starting to tackle much bigger projects here at Second Thought. This episode was the longest one we've done, as well as the most expensive. It took countless hours of planning and research, plus 2 of us flying out to East Palestine for a couple days of shooting, then a huge amount of time in post-production to make this thing as good as it could be. In order to make this kind of content sustainable, I need your help. The nature of our videos makes it hard to keep sponsors, and going to 2 uploads per month instead of 4 has cut my AdSense revenue in half. If you'd like to help support the channel, the best possible way you can do that is by signing up for Nebula with the link below. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite creators, and it's a place where we can experiment and produce the content we really want to make, without the fear of age restriction or demonetization. Recording this a few days before you're watching it, I'm going to guess this episode was demonetized. That's why I'm so glad we have Nebula. I can put up meaningful content. I can help share the stories of people who are suffering and who have been left behind by those with the power to prevent these tragedies. YouTube doesn't care about that, but Nebula does. I'll also be putting up a bunch of behind-the-scenes content going forward. Stuff from the shoot that doesn't make the final cut, commentary from the crew, little things like that. Getting to see how videos are made has always been fascinating to me, so I'm excited to be able to share that with all of you. And now, if you sign up with my link, you'll also get access to the new Nebula classes, where creators host classes on how to be a creator. There's something for everyone, and it's another way for you to take a peek behind the scenes and see what really goes into making content. Your favorite creators teaching you how to create. In my opinion, that's pretty cool. Here's the heartfelt part. Every person who signs up using my link is directly contributing to the financial stability of the channel. Second Thought would not be possible without the generosity of viewers like you, especially since pretty much all my sponsors have bailed. And it doesn't take a huge investment to keep the lights on. If you sign up using the link below, you'll get access to Nebula and Nebula classes for under $3 a month. With my link, the annual plan is just $30 a year, or $2.50 a month. I honestly think that's an amazing deal for all the great content on Nebula. So if you'd like to help support this channel and get access to the streaming platform built and owned by the creators, sign up for Nebula with my link below. It really does help support me and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.